This is week 2, politics of the dollar. And last week I went into, well, the beginnings of the country, really, how this country really begins to shape itself economically. Went into the Currency Act of 1764. And I went into Alexander Hamilton wiping out the debt, and then Mr. Jackson later on, who kills what you're going to call the central bank, and then this country's going to disperse its money among a number of banks until, of course, 1913 with the Federal Reserve Act, and we are back to a central bank controlled by private bankers for the most part here. But the idea here and I'm going to get into this, and that, you notice the title on that handout, Financial Imperialism. That's exactly what this is, what you're going to see. And let's start by going back to where I left off last week about the United States growing as an economic power. You know, that thing we call the Civil War, which really, again, you've heard me say this before, was really the revolt of the planters. The Confederacy was a revolution. Well, they don't win it. They lost. And after 1865, what takes primacy here? Hamilton's idea of a financial and industrialized America. That's what wins out. And you see here in 1865, America has some 144,000 factories, and by 1900, 335,000. Factory centers of production. And, you know, in 1900, this country would produce $2 billion in manufactured goods. By 1900, $11.5 billion. It went up 5 times. And so you see where this country is going. But at the same time, if you're growing industrially, aren't you growing financially? And don't you need a viable banking system to underwrite a lot of what's going on here? Yeah, you do. And so you see here, this country by the mid-1890s, but 1900, we are now the world's ranking economic power. We've displaced the British. Of course, keep in mind here, on a singular basis, yes, we've displaced the British, but Europe in total can still outproduce us. But on a single basis, we have displaced the British, but that's of note because the British are what? The world's ranking colonial power, imperialist power at this point. However, again, and I've mentioned this in previous talks, the idea of manifest destiny, that's changing. That's changing. You know, no longer with the War of 1898 is this a continental agenda for expansion across this great continent. That's done. You know, Chesapeake Bay is already linked with the Golden Gate. It's over and done. And again, that was done by who? People like yourselves. White people grabbing land as they move west. Of course, that's nice to say, but that land was virtually owned by who? The Indians. And they're going to be cast into the dustbin of history. However, with the Spanish-American War, it is no longer mom-pa cattle grabbing land, folks. It's now the Army and the Navy. So manifest destiny has changed. And what I find fascinating here is, again, getting back to what we call the Civil War, the revolt of the planters, for the most part, American imperialism from the 18th into the 19th century, for the most part, had been the common everyday Joe, grabbing land. Again, that's over with. And so now your government's going to change as a result of this, because now you're seeing the growth of big companies. You're seeing the growth of big banks. And so is that going to change the country? Of course it is. Of course it is. Look what you got now. And so in the Spanish-American War, we defeat the Spanish in a 4-month war. This war really is not looked upon at all anymore. And yet it's a linchpin. Shows where the country's going at this point. And so what did you see here? We grabbed colonies here. Puerto Rico, Cuba becomes a free nation, if you believe that one. Philippines, how about Guam? And we're strengthening our grip on Hawaii. Now that's to be expected because Hawaii's, what, 2,000 miles off the west coast, and is that a jump-off point into the Pacific? Yeah, of course it is. the Navy's going to set up shop here. You know, Pearl Harbor's already being arranged as a Navy base. And you know what that's going to attract on December 7, 1941. But the fact of the matter is, what's interesting about this is Cuba. You know, I'm going to get into Cuba, but let me start with the Philippines first. You know, we were there supposedly to see to the liberation of the Philippine people. You know, and in 1900, that 1902, that Philippine Organic Act, by which we would guarantee that the Philippines would have a bicameral form of government, legislative branch, so on and so forth, and also the insurgents who were fighting, and as I put in this handout, fighting against American benevolence, would be given a free pass here. You know, we're not going to hold it against you. And yet, what's interesting enough here to see is that who's going to be the real beneficiary of our taking of the Philippines? American businesses. Because by 1930 actually, you're going to see 135 American companies own some $433 million of Filipino land. You know, the day's coming. You know,
we improve the Philippine way of living. I mean, did it improve their quality of life?
Not overly so. I mean, they also, by that act, they were supposed to be guaranteed independence. Of course, they're not going to see that for over 4 decades after the Second World War. So there's a long way to go here. Yes?
Why is the bicameral legislature so wonderful? In the United States, the reason was that you had a bunch of states.
Right.
But in the Philippines...
Well, in the Philippines, you got a whole bunch of islands. They're maybe not considered states, but you got a bunch of islands. I mean, the Philippines is spread out all over the map in that area of the globe. So... Somebody else had a...
What did the U.S. corporations want to own in the Philippines? Was it plantation land? What was it that they were...
Plantation land and whatever resources that they could grab. But keep in mind one thing. The watchword here is the Philippines are a jump-off to China. And that's ultimately what America wants, to really ensconce itself in China. And that was one of the reasons for the 1853 visit by Commodore Perry in Japan. You know, that's a jump-off point for China. You know, we're getting into that colonial race too here. The British are already ensconced in India. You know, the Dutch in the Dutch East Indies. Vietnam is already well on its way to controlling Southeast Asia. Well, we want a piece of the action too. We're growing here as a power. Yes?
With the advent of imperialism, however, not only did we get the land, but there were also markets to sell our goods to, even though that wasn't the main reason, because most of these people didn't have that much money. But when you take a look at imperialism, am I correct in saying it just wasn't that they went hopping from one to another? They really had a game plan.
Well, yeah. And in fact, another aspect of this Spanish-American War is that we get Cuba. Now, Cuba we're going to develop as a satrap for American goods. And keep in mind, again, this idea of kicking the Spanish out of Cuba and guaranteeing Cuban independence. Well, you can see this in the 1901 Platt Amendment. Orville Platt, senator from Connecticut. And the Platt Amendment, sure, you know, they're going to have a government, you know, the Cubans will have their own government, but we reserve the right to intervene in Cuba anytime we want to protect Cuba from third parties that want to invade Cuba. Now, what gave us the right to do that? But at the same time, we are taking control of the Cuban economy. And as the years pass by, you know, this is a country that only has 3 or 4 million people, and yet it's going to be number 6 on the list for trade with the United States. 80% of all imports going to Cuba come from the United States. And 75% of their exports, guess where they're going? United States. And so it becomes actually a satellite in the American his imperialistic designs. That's virtually what it becomes here. I mean, keep in mind, we're already into Nicaragua and so on and so forth, expanding ourselves south, besides going into Asia. You see here with regards to China is another one. Now this is interesting. 1900, the America-China Development Company wants to fund a railroad, the Canton-Hankow Railroad. And the Chinese government will give them a concession. And the stock that's supposed to be used to raise money, the Chinese order here that concession, American investors will buy up the stock, but they don't want us selling that stock. And they want us to control the stock. No third-party investors. Well, what do you think the United States investors are going to do? They're going to sell these on the market, and most of it's bought up by Belgian investors. Well, what are the Chinese going to do? They're going to cancel the concession. Well, what do American investors do in answer to that? Well, they buy back the shares. At the same time, the State Department tells the Chinese government you cannot interfere in American business practices. And China will be forced to buy up the shares at $6.75 million, and the America-China Development Company reaped a profit of $3.75 million. Now, what else would you call that? Financial imperialism? They made a big profit out of this. And this is where they are going with the dollar. Keep in mind, as we are growing as a power, you're going to exercise that power. We are producing goods left and right, and yet the feeling is the American public cannot absorb all those goods. So what do you have to do? Export them. Mexico, here's another one. Porfirio Diaz was the dictator from 1876 to 1910. Sits in Mexico City for 34 years. Not a bad run. Not a bad run. But did Americans make out here? Yeah. By the time he's out of office, 1910, keep in mind, oil is coming on here. Here we go. Oil is coming on here. Navies are especially the United States and the Royal Navy, are weaning themselves off coal. Is Mexico going to be an important power, especially in this time, as far as an oil power? Yes, but are they going to control it? No. No. In fact, Marion Letcher, who was an American consul in Mexico, stated that by the time the Diaz had been dethroned here, we're talking 1910, even afterwards, America will be in Mexico to the tune of $1,057,770,000. Some 70% or more of the Mexican railroads in American business hands. At least 80% of the Mexican oil industry in American hands. And that $1 billion plus, of course, that outdoes the British have $321 million worth of investments in Mexico. And so what does that make Mexico? We kind of forget this here. That makes Mexico really at the stage of the development of oil as an important commodity here, the first real battleground of these great powers trying to take control of oil. Mexico. Not the Middle East. Mexico. Now, I find that concept interesting, especially after the British had already signed that concession with Persia in 1901. They'll strike oil in 1909. Mexico. Interestingly enough, Mexico in 1904 produced 220,000 barrels of oil. By 1909, 3.3 million barrels. By 1913, 26 million barrels. And by 1920, 157 million barrels of oil. Yeah, oil's important because keep in mind in 1918, even though the British are drilling for oil in Persia, In Iraq, they have to fashion yet. You know, this is still 1918. Some 75 to 80% of the oil that's going to be used by the Allies in World War I, specifically the British and the French, comes from the United States and from Mexico, which in essence is controlled by the United States. 80% of the oil used by the French Army, and keep in mind the French Army at this point is one of the world's leaders in going motorized with moving men and equipment. You know, again, oil, that means what? Gasoline, the internal combustion engine. Why would you want to move your equipment and men on horseback or wagons? We now have the truck. Yes?
Mark, what is the American investment in Mexico today?
Oh, that the numbers on that I really couldn't give you.
But I read somewhere that it's diminished since because of the turmoil between the United States and Mexico over the last 4 or 5 decades.
Yeah, and of course I'm sure China's getting involved in there too. That's another aspect of this. But this shows you here the plight of Mexico by the time of the First World War. Now keep in mind too, you know, the change in the politics in Mexico. 1910, Diaz is out. Francisco Madero takes over. Madero, though, is going to be assassinated by this general named Victoriano Huerta. Huerta can be a problem because Huerta will want to cater to American and German interests, and that threatens American primacy in oil. That threatens American primacy. Edward Denny from Los Angeles, an investor who has money tied up in oil in Mexico, urges the U.S. government to start procedures to make sure America maintains its primacy in Mexico. Albert Fall, who even goes farther, Albert Fall is a U.S. senator with investments in Mexico, urges the Wilson government to the point even consider military intervention. Now keep in mind the problem with military intervention here. Yeah, we did intervene in Mexico in places like Tampico and Veracruz, like in 1914. In fact, Veracruz is where this Marine, Smedley Darlington Butler, earns his first Medal of Honor in action against the Mexicans. The first of 2 years in a row he got Medal of Honors. Medals of Honor, he got 2 years in a row. One in Mexico, one in Haiti. And I'm going to hit Haiti next. But the fact of the matter is, a wholesale intervention here? How's that going to work? We don't have the Army for this. And if we did, keep in mind, you've got various factions vying for control in Mexico. The worst thing we could do is launch an invasion of Mexico and become embroiled in a Mexican civil or revolution, civil war going on as well, because what's that going to breed? Nationalism among these people? To throw us out, which means we would have been involved in a counterinsurgency effort probably for years. Not a very good way to go here, especially on our own border. Although, truth be told, there was an issue coming out of this Civil War / Mexican Revolution in 1915. A group of revolutionaries hatched this thing known as Plan de San Diego, which was to raise Mexicans along the American border, Mexican Americans north of the border, also raised Japanese Americans, Apaches and Yaqui Indians, and blacks to rise up against America and carve out Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, and part of Colorado and return it to Mexico. But first have an independent republic and then ask for admittance into Mexico. And all white males ages 16 and over were to be exterminated. This thing went virtually no place. Blacks didn't want to get involved. American Indians weren't going to get involved. And Japanese Americans, they weren't going to get involved. Mexican Americans, they don't want any part of this. But it does start a guerrilla war on the Texas-Mexican border. It lasts for about a year, and 300 some odd Mexicans are going to be killed. Some Mexican Americans. Of course, the Texas Rangers, The Texas Rangers don't have enough men, so they're going to deputize the ranchers. Now, what do you think ranchers are doing here? Well, they're taking some of the Mexican Americans their land. But that doesn't belie the fact that Pancho Villa is going to launch a raid on Columbus, New Mexico in March of 1916. This will prompt Woodrow Wilson to do a riposte here. He's going to send General John Blackjack Pershing into Mexico with 5,000 troops to get Pancho Villa, which he's never going to do. This punitive expedition turned out to be a failure, and it's going to cost the American taxpayer upwards of $130 million. But of course, the following year, where do we go from here? Into France, into the First World War. Haiti. Now, Haiti has had a checkered career, hasn't it? Throughout the French in 1803-1804 Toussaint Louverture, the first real black successful revolution, which we are not going to trumpet here, by the way. Of course, the South is behind that. Why? You still had slavery in this country. Why would they want to trumpet the fact, gee, black slaves threw the French out? That's the last thing they want. But anyway, in 1912-1914, the National Railroad Company in Haiti, mostly under control by the French, they're supposed to build a railroad. Now, according to the agreement here, to build this railroad in Haiti, which was supposed to be divided into 20 sections, one section to be done, you move on to the next section, to the next section, to the next section, until all 20 sections are done. According to the deal, once this railroad was built, Haiti, get this one, Haiti was supposed to pay the interest on the bonds for this endeavor. However, keep in mind something else that's going on here. America has been trying to get into Haiti, especially National City Bank. They want to take up all, or at least get part of the customs collections of the Haiti government. Of all the nerve. Of all the nerve. However, keep in mind when this railroad is done, only 4 sections of the 20 are complete within the time frame. And so what does Haiti say? We're not paying the interest on the bonds. We're not paying the interest. You didn't fulfill your obligation in the time frame. 20 sections is only 4 done. And so who's going to take over this situation? The United States. In fact, in December of 1914, to show you how serious we are in getting involved in the Haitian financial structure here, they land the Marines in December 1914. They will march on the National Bank and they will remove $500,000 and it goes into the bank vault of National City Bank in New York City. That's not much different than what Obama did in Libya, by the way, when we got involved in that. And in December, in 1915, we will take over those bonds for that railroad that wasn't finished. And National City Bank will reap a $2 million profit on an unfinished railroad. Interesting what's going on here. Interesting what's going on here as you begin to engage in a foreign policy exclusive of soldiers or Marines, for the most part, and using a currency. Dollar diplomacy? Isn't that what the Taft administration said it was going to do? Yeah, interesting. But the First World War. Now, here we go. First World War. Again, in America, you know, we don't get involved in this war until what? The 2/3 point? 1917. But keep in mind the gravity of this conflict for especially the British and the French. Well, the Germans too and the Italians, but I'm focus on the British and the French here. This thing known as the Triple Alliance, which was Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire of Italy. Of course, the Italians back out. The Italians back out. And so when the war virtually starts by August 4, 1914, when all the major powers are in it, it's Britain, France, and Tsarist Russia against Germany and Austria-Hungary. It's in November 1914 that the Ottoman Empire takes up the third spot in the batting order because Italy didn't get in. Italy backed out from supporting Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They will go with the Allies. Now, don't think the Italians are so cavalier that they're doing this because they're nice people. They're doing this because the British and the French promised them more territory. That's one of the major reasons why. But the Ottomans will join the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. However, this is at this point the world's largest industrialized, commercialized, corporatized war. The British and the French, especially the British, are still the world's ranking colonial powers. You know, when you talk about financial imperialism, again with the British Empire, we, by the way, by 1912, 1914, have some $3 billion, $3.5 billion in foreign investments at this stage of our development. The Germans had something like $6.5 billion. The French, $9.5 billion. Britain, 20. Part of being the world's largest empire. All those investments overseas. What is it? The sun never sets on the British Empire. Remember that one? Now, 20 billion may not sound like a lot today. It was then. Isn't that when money bought something? Mm-hmm. But the worm is going to change here. It's going to change. As this war keeps going on, 1914, 1915. I always like to call 1915 based off a book by Lynn McDonald, and I think he's right here. 1915 really rams home the reality of modern war. He calls that year the loss of innocence. He wrote a book on it. The book's about that thick. It's a really good book on 1915. The Loss of Innocence. Boy, is that a name for that? Is that a title for that book? And that's a real name for that year. By 1916, you see where this is going. The Battle of Verdun. The Battle of the Somme. I mean, at Verdun, in 10 months, between the Germans and the French, 750,000 men. Dead, wounded, missing, who knows? Prisoners. The Somme. The French are screaming. The British, you gotta launch an offensive. Take the heat off us down here on the southern end of the trench line. And so the British will. July 1, 1916, they'll launch their attack at the Somme and have 60,000 casualties in 24 hours. I mean, this is modern war. And then they scream to the Russians, you gotta launch a big offensive on the Eastern Front, take the pressure off us. And the Russians will. And they will create, in the summer of 1916, 600,000 Austria-Hungarian casualties. They crippled the Austro-Hungarian army. Yet that cost them 1 million men. I mean, this war is on steroids. It's unbelievable, the casualty lists. This is 1916 alone. And by June 1916, the Allies are into the United States here for $900 million borrowing. Between June and July, between June and December 1916, $900 million becomes $1.8 billion. Out of that $1.8 billion that they're borrowing and spending, $800 billion the British are on the hook for. Yet fortunately for them, they've got $960 million in collateral here, so they can cover it. But banks, the Morgan interests, they're one of the biggest lenders to the Allies, the Morgans. Even in the early part of 1917, getting into January, February, the British overdraft by $400 million. I mean, that's what this war is costing. Keep in mind, the world's ranking empire, the British. And it's to the point where they can't afford the war. And if they can't afford the war, if they're having trouble making their bills, what does that do for us as the dealer? Does that suck us deeper and deeper into this because of the money? Again, the money. Yes. And it becomes an issue. It becomes an issue. The fear here, and again, going back to, weren't you told this in school? You know, it was unrestricted submarine warfare that got us into the First World War. There is truth to this. Didn't Wilson warn the Germans periodically, especially after the Lusitania? Remember that one? Well, it was more than the Lusitania. Hey, look, if you don't cut out unrestricted submarine warfare, you're going to force my hand. And again, there is precedence for this. Look at how many times America got into war because of incidents at sea. Remember the War of 1812, the impressment of American seamen by the British? Or the absconding of American transports on the open ocean by the British? How about 1898? Remember the Maine? 1917, unrestricted submarine warfare. How about 1941, Pearl Harbor? And how about 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident? There is a track record here of America getting into the wars because of what? Freedom of the seas. That's one thing we get pretty touchy about here. There is a history of this. But going back to 1917, yes, unrestricted submarine warfare. But the bigger fear here is Russia. Russia. After that huge offensive, and they lose 1 million men in 1916, that's a cumulative effect of the bodies they're losing. And what are people doing here in the fall and the winter of 1916 going into 1917? Soldiers are dropping their rifles and they're walking back to the farm. They've had enough. After all the losses, they've had enough. Well, how is Russia supposed to stay in the war without an army? That's not going to happen. And in 1917, February 1917, the revolution. Well, what do you think the bankers are seeing here? If Russia gets out of the war and the Germans are able to move a lot of those troops on the eastern front to the western front, the British and French are getting tired here. What's the guarantee that if the Germans win this war, we're going to get paid back with all that money we've loaned? How's that going to work? And so what are some of the bankers and even some of the politicians telling Wilson? We may have to get involved in this war. It's not just unrestricted submarine warfare. The pocketbook. And on April 2nd, 1917, Woodrow Wilson will go before Congress and ask for that declaration of war. And it'll take Congress 4 days to deliberate here. 4 days. He'll get his declaration of war. Keep in mind here, as we begin to, and that's another thing about Washington too. And this is interesting. All the money that American banks had built up, the Morgans, poster child expression here, they can't guarantee the British and the French and Italy. This is, in other words, financing the Entente. So guess who's going to have to take up the slack here? The United States government. The first Liberty Loan Act is passed. Get a load of that name. First Liberty Loan Act. We will underwrite, the United States government will underwrite $9.5 billion. That's a lot of money back then, folks. That's a lot of money. Then when you take into account the banks are already into them for 2.5 billion, the United States government throws in another 9.5 billion. I mean, we're talking what, $12 billion here? We have to get into the war. We have no choice at this point if we want to make sure we're going to get that money back. Yes?
The interesting thing is that you see the influence of the banking class on the Wilson administration through members of his cabinet. because they were so terrified about defaulting. I mean, they were in there for, okay, $2.5 billion. But then we throw in another $9.5 billion with no guarantees. But it just shows you how much influence the banking element
Well,
has.
your point here about the influence of the banks is to be appreciated here, and I don't think that is when we really talk about World War I. I mean, you are growing as a power on the national scene. That means you have to maintain what? Economic primacy, because if you can't do that, guess what happens to you? You fall off your perch. That's what's happening to the British and French right now. The British had $3.3 billion in assets in this country in 1914. It's down to $1.1 billion in 1918. They have to liquidate to pay. They have no choice. The French have to liquidate 70 or 75% of their assets here. They got to pay. They have to pay. And interestingly enough, a company like DuPont, by 1917, they're producing upwards of 40% of the munitions for the Allies. And again, that stock mentioned before, that stock going from $20 a share in 1914 to $1,000 in 1918. Where is the money going? Here. The United States will ingest $907 million of the world's gold. And when this is over, we're going to control half the world's gold. Interesting. A country on 7%, 6.5%, 7% of the world's land mass, with maybe 6% of the world's population, controls half the world's gold by the time this is over. Some 2/3 of the world's oil, 40% of the iron, the tin, the silver. Boy, where is the wealth going? Here. Does that help your currency? You better believe it does. You better believe it does, because what are the banks going to? What are these countries going to want? The greenback. Are we in competition now with the British financial interest in London? The pound? Yeah, we sure are, and we're making inroads here. We are making inroads here. Interestingly enough, this country, which was a debtor nation in 1913, will be a creditor nation by 1919. Interestingly enough, and you see where this is going. American traders and marketers, before the war, usually when they were going overseas to invest, they did so through British banking offices. Guess what's happening now? By 1925, folks, the 8 largest banks in the United States, the Morgan's obviously one of them, now have 107 branch offices overseas. Where is this going? And when you've gone from 1914 to this posture in 1925, is that increasing American financial power overseas? Yeah, it sure is. Because by 1930, interestingly enough, you go back to 1912, 1914, when America had $3 to $3.5 billion in investments overseas in assets, and the British had $20 billion. We are now equal to the British in 1930. And the British are declining as a power, and where is America going? Up. We're going up. Germany after the war is a basket case. It's a basket case. But we will float German bonds. The Dawes Plan, 1923, 1924. And between 1922-23 to 1933, we're going to pour upwards of $7 billion into Germany. Does that increase our power here? Yes. Germany had nationalized railroads, yet we $110 million of investments in the German railroads that might be German railroads, but guess who has a say on the Railroad Commission? We do. It's our money, isn't it? Of course it is. Of course it is. Of course, you have to look at it another way, too. When we begin pouring money into Germany, what happened to the agenda of the extreme right, like people like the Stahlhelm and the Nazis? Well, what happens after the Depression? 'Depression? 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 interesting here. Absolutely fascinating. Yet, with the decline of the British and French coming on here, and again the Depression hitting, and we get hit hard too. Let's understand this, that we get hit hard enough where in 1933, when Mr. Roosevelt takes office, we have a 25% unemployment rate. We have over 12 million people out of work. Now, 25% is a huge, is not chopped liver here. But add to that, is there a social safety net in the country at this point? No. How many wives are working? How many two-family incomes do you have going on here?
Zero.
Well, some women are working, but is it like it is now?
No.
Nowhere near close. And so when you have 25% unemployment, and most of the breadwinners here for these families are men, ouch, that hurts. But then again, interestingly enough, the Roosevelt administration goes through these alphabet soup of programs, CCC, WPA, NRA. NRA really is a blueprint for a corporate socialist state, but it's another one of these programs that get us out of this depression. Yet, with the growing clouds of war, what in the end is going to get us out of this depression? And military production, producing military goods. But at the same time here, the country is going to be a lot richer by 1945. And what started in 1914 is virtually going to be completed by 1945. And I'm talking what happens to the British Empire. Forget the French. I mean, the French really are a non-starter here after 1940. And I get into discussions with this with some other people about how the French really ceased being a colonial power in 1954 when they got kicked out of North Vietnam. And I say no. They lost that game in June 1940 when Hitler occupied them. When Hitler occupied them. They're done. You think they could hold North Vietnam after the war? No, they couldn't. They got thrown out. Just like they're going to get thrown out of Algeria by 1962. No, you see the change coming. Because by 1945, America's financial power is unchallengeable. The British, again, let's go back to the British. You see how this is turning here. The British were a $16 billion creditor nation, and in 1945, a $12 billion debtor. They've only got $12 million in gold left. By the time the war is over with, we don't control just 50% of the world's gold. Try 77, 79%. The change going on, and it's interesting here too because of what Mr. Roosevelt says. And I like this quote because it kind of shoots my liberal friends in the foot here. I mean, I have my arch-conservative friends. I like to tweak their noses too, but it's fun to play. It's fun to really tweak the noses on both sides of the pole. This is Roosevelt, 1940. Again, as the British decline, we are going where? Up. As you know, he said, and this was to a bunch of journalists, as you know, he said, the British need money in this war. They own lots of things all over the world, such as tramways and electric light companies. Well, in carrying on this war, the British may have to part with that control, and we, perhaps, can step in or make the financial arrangements for eventual local ownership. It is a terribly interesting thing, and one of the most important things for our future trade is to study it in that light. What's he saying? Pax Americana is what he's saying. That's what he's saying. If the British are going to decline, who has to pick up the slack? We do. And so what you're seeing develop here is a change in the global dynamics of power. And you can see the power of the dollar coming on here. Bretton Woods, right? After 3 shocks here. You've had the 1914-18 conflict. You've had a depression. Now the 39-45 conflict where, this tremendous industrialized, commercialized, corporatized war. You had 15 million dead 1914-18, now you're going to have upwards of 60 million dead in the next chapter here. I mean, that's upwards of 75 million dead in 10 years. That's 7.5 million people dying every year in war. Yes?
After World War I, from what you said, the number of American banks and offices all over the world were basically in Europe. When we got into the Depression, there was the run on the banks. The banks didn't have the money. They just had to close the doors.
Oh, well, Roosevelt's gonna extend a bank holiday and close all the banks down.
But how many banks closed permanently, even though there was a bank holiday? Because the investors couldn't get their money back. The banks didn't have it. They were overextended. There was no liquidity.
Well, you go to 1929, 1930, you were losing over upwards of 1,000 or more banks a year.
What happened to the overseas banks? Did they also constrict?
Some did. But we're going to survive as a global power, obviously, here. We are going to be the money man. We are going to be the global power here. And the part of that is financial. Getting back to the British here, interestingly enough, they're busted. $12 billion debtor. They only have $12 million in gold left. And to show you our newfound power here, newfound power with the dollar, which I think they ought to rename the currency and call it the bludgeon. 1945, the British, technically busted, come to us for $3.7 billion. They need money. They need money. Yeah, you can have that money. You can have that money. But $930 million has to be spent in the United States or no deal. Number two, all your imports have to be paid with the dollar or gold. Well, $12 million worth of gold left? That's not going to last long. Oh, and if you think you're going to go to some of your Commonwealth countries for a better deal, forget it, our deal is off. Well, where else are they going to go? Where else are they going to go? And Lord Boothby, who was a well-known member of Parliament during the war years, will go before Parliament. And you know what he's going to call this for the British? An economic Munich. That's pretty strong language, folks. Of course, he can say it a lot more eloquently being British than I can. He will say how they were stabbed in the back. That's what he's going to say. Egypt. Yeah, you can have some money. Sure, you can have some money. Egypt would like to establish air traffic service between Egypt and Europe and back again. Well, sure, you can do that with that money, but guess who gets primacy in the airline routes before the Europeans? American airline companies. Ethiopia, or Abyssinia, if you will. They want some money. Sure, you can have some money, but instead of military bases going to the British, guess who has first dibs on them? We do. We do. You see what we're doing with our currency here? Why do you need, George Kennan argues this, what do you need a large army for? We got a currency, it's called the dollar. He was one of the co-authors of the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan was fashioned for what? I remember growing up as a kid, we saved the world. We helped our fellow man. Yeah, but for what?
To save ourselves.
Well, yes, to save ourselves, as you say. But the fact of the matter is here, you've got an army of 16,112,000, according to the VA, by September 2nd, 45. 15 million of them are going to get out. You better have a job for them. And so the idea here is to fashion Western Europe and Japan as a dumping ground for American goods. And what we're going to do in 1945, 48, and I vaguely remember the 1950s. I remember when everyone was still buying American. I remember the DeSoto.
So do I.
Me too.
Me too.
So do we all.
The Nash, right? The Nash. The Kaiser, remember that car? But the fact of the matter is they were buying American cars. American radios, television sets, so on and so forth. You know how that went. Why? Because we were the only game in town, backed by this currency. And so George Kennan, not being a stupid man, understood this very well. And George Marshall is going to say in 1948 that if any country wants to go communist, their deal is off. We offered the Russians. We offered this to the Russians. Stalin says, "Niet." You know, we wanted them to pay off that lend-lease loan. You know, maybe one way of doing that is getting them into the Marshall Plan. Of course, that means what? They're going to be deeper in debt. We offered them $1 billion. Stalin said no. And Stalin also says, oh, by the way, the nations in the Eastern Bloc don't want it either. Nice that he speaks up for his fellow man here. And so you see this, the end of the British and French colonial empire is virtually here, especially it should be the British be the last man standing here, I guess. That's poetic justice, if you want to use that term. But the world is changing. And America is now the #1 power. And a lot of that is based on what? An unchallengeable currency. Yes?
I just wanted to mention that my dad was in the First World War, and he got discharged in 1918 because they couldn't afford to pay. That's what it says on the discharge date.
Say that.
He got discharged in 1918 because they couldn't afford to pay your father.
Wait a minute, wait. Are we talking the American Army?
Yes, the American Army. That Navy.
The Navy?
Wow.
He did. Holy smoke.
You know, at one point, and I'll get to your question, at one point, believe it or not, you go back to 1900, 1910, especially, you know, in the punitive expedition into Mexico, many American companies didn't want to loan to the Army. What do you want to go there for? There's no future in that. They're late on paying, and sometimes they don't pay. But after 1945, everybody and his uncle wants to be involved with the armed forces. That's where this goes. Interesting observation. Yes, sir?
Is it any different what the United States did to the rest of the world then to what the banks do to individuals today? They talk you into credit cards, and then they own you, like the United States owned all these countries in Europe.
Well, yeah, that's an issue. I mean, I you know, bouncing off what you're saying, I went to a rally or two from these kids who were against assault weapons. You know, these high school students against assault weapons. And my wife and I went for coffee after the last one we went to, and we were talking about this. And I said, they're going to get a backlash here. They are going to get a backlash. And I said, the backlash, part of that backlash is not that they're against assault weapons, but if by chance they can get something done on that score, what could be next on a politically organized, supercharged group of young people? Student loan debt? Mm-hmm. You know, you better kill this in the womb now, instead of letting them get their assault weapons banned and then moving on to something else. Don't think some people aren't thinking that. And so is that, again, get back to the money? Yes. Yes, it does. Yes.
Actually, England would have had a major issue if they weren't able to get the loan from the United States and forced to spend the money here, because that, you know, get into the summer of '45, my dad mentioned in his letters home that he says, these people don't have nothing in their stores. No
Right.
consumer, no toothpaste, forget it. Right?
Yeah.
Toothbrush, forget it.
Yeah.
Clothes, forget it.
But I
They
mean,
don't have nothing.
but when you, right, and when you look at the span of the decades here from 1914 to 45, you know, it's constant warfare that helped to kill the British Empire. And I think that's something we as voters should understand when we take a look at this country now. I mean, when you're down to allowing your banks like Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, J.P. Morgan, and Chase laundering drug money down in the Caribbean, and so they get a cut of the action to help finance our war, our making war in Iraq and Afghanistan, I find that a problem. I find that a problem. And so again, you know, and the problem here is, and I get into this more as we go down the road here. The problem here is that dollar, your standard of living depends on it. And so what's going to happen when other countries don't want to invest in it anymore? I mean, we kind of forced the issue by 45. Where else are you going to go? There's only one dealer in this game here, and that's us. That's us. And you know, the other big winner of the war, the Soviet Union, the ruble. You're going to invest in that? No, no. You're going to want to get in on the dollar. And so, by us having things like the Marshall Plan after the war and us using our dollar, why do we need a large army for? We don't. We don't. And so, what we began in the the latter part of the 19th century. Look what's happened by 45. There's just no other competitor. We own it. We own the market virtually lock, stock, and barrel. Fascinating, fascinating series of events here. It really is. It really is. It's fascinating history. Yes?
Didn't we run the Cold War by outspending the Russians?
Yeah, we did.
Russians went broke and we didn't.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean...
Cold War.
Right. I mean, and I'll get into this more again when we come back, but I mean, just to answer your question, I mean, you saw when Reagan took office, what did Reagan do? Up the defense budget. Now, you know, again, you know, I got into a discusussion, it was a few years ago. Well, you know, Pope John Paul II helped bring down the Soviet Union. I said, what, are you kidding me? You got to be kidding me. Two things really helped bring down the Soviet Union. Three things. That progression over the Cold War, yes. But then when Reagan wanted to up the defense budget, you know, there's number one and number two, you know, as military powers. And yet, the Soviet Union was 63rd in living standards. They're going to match wallets with the United States. And the other thing was the Afghan War. You know, that war really showed how empty the Soviet Union really was politically, socially. I mean, these guys went home just like American vets went home, and they're telling their families what a horror show this was. And so then it begins to get to the point where the Soviet Union is a spent unit. And what do you think some of these people in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, East Germany are saying? Well, Christmas, if these people in bed sheets and sandals can throw the Soviets out of those mountains, what are we waiting for? And what happened to the Soviet Union? Collapses. So, yeah. But then it goes back to George Kennan. No, containment. We can outlast them. We don't need a big war. We can outlast them. Yes?
Would you expand just a little bit more on your idea that there will be a backlash against the, the students wanting more gun control, like the assault weapons? I mean, how would they impose a backlash on them by raising their student debt obligations?
Well, it's not raising the student debt obligations. It's maybe even doing away with student loan debt. Bernie Sanders even came up with that idea. Could that? Keep in mind. You're going to hear this again. They took a poll there was a poll done in January of 2016. As the presidential election is beginning to heat up here, of people under 30 years old, 43% have an affinity for socialism.
Yeah.
That's the last thing J.P. Morgan and Chase wants to hear. And that's the last thing people like Mitt Romney want to hear.
There's a headline in the New York Times today on student loan, and I didn't read it. Somebody else must have. It's on the front page. I mean, I just haven't gotten to it. I don't know. It's about some kind of a fraud. I don't.
Yeah, I haven't seen the headline either.
Yeah, it's right on the front page.
Unless they're trying to renegotiate interest.
Yeah, that's right. Some sort of, student. They're abusing the banks.
Well, it's not like they haven't been doing this all along.
Right.
And so when you look at the students getting together, and it's more than just in a few places.
Right.
It's coast to coast here. It's numbers, and that's what it would take. And I mean, I've listened to some of these 15. I listened to one 15-year-old girl in particular at a rally out just outside Norwalk City Hall, and she says, "In 3 years, I vote."
Good for her.
Good.
And she says, you politicians better remember that.
Oh,
Yeah. And so, again, if this could catch fire, there's going to, again, there'll be a backlash. I mean, the NRA and their supporters aren't going to put up with this. They're just not. The question is, who outlasts who? One side has the money, perhaps the other side gets the numbers. I mean, the numbers of bodies. And that's what it would take. But again, you know, once people get one agenda done, well, now we tick this off the list. Number 2, then number 3, and number 4. So you got to. So if you're one of the power brokers, you got to nip this in the bud now. You can't wait, or else you're going to have a problem. But then again, if this thing with these kids really grabs on here and really catches fire. You don't think groups like Black Lives Matter, the anti-fracking people, the people who want that $12, $15 an hour minimum wage might not latch on to this, and now you got a real movement, a tsunami. Could that happen? Don't think it can. Don't think it can. Again, control of the money here. So, yes.
60 Minutes last night had an interview with the core leaders from Hartford. And it was very, very interesting what they said about those who are coming to them with the money. They will only take the money if there is no if. They don't want anyone else's agenda. They just want to hit home on the magazines and the assault weapons. And they seem to really be focused on it. So I would wonder if they would be willing to, and I would hope they wouldn't, be willing to, let's say, join in partnerships with the anti-frackers and Black Lives. I mean, these are all viable movements. But I think once you start limiting your own agenda, it does take away some of your.
Well, the problem here is, and, you know, I understand your point, but every it has to be political. And you're not going to get anything done unless it's not political. That's reality here. But like every other political movement, doesn't that political movement evolve?
It does.
Yes. And so, you know, again, they have that uphill battle against the money because in the end, you think how much help they're going to get from Democrats and Republicans? They're owned.
A lot of money
They're
from
owned.
private sources.
Well, you know, again, going back to what you're saying, when Margaret Sanger, and I've been giving talks on Margaret Sanger, you know, she opened up the first birth control clinic in this country in 1916, and it got shut down. But in an effort to, you know, she was appealing more to working class and poor women, you know, for birth control, contraception, which contraception was illegal then. You couldn't even get a diaphragm, believe it or not. In fact, later her and her husband were smuggling diaphragms into this country from Europe through Canada in crates, boxes or crates marked 3-in-1 oil. Well, John Brown, remember John Brown? Remember the, you know, in that horrible episode in Kansas, right before the Civil War? Oh, he was smuggling rifles for the anti-slavers into Kansas in boxes marked Bibles. Yeah, but the fact of the matter is, Margaret Sanger in 1921 tried to open up another birth control clinic, but it wasn't called birth control clinic. It was called the Clinical Research Bureau. This was after a judge by the name of Frederick E. Crane wrote a ruling. He was in the New York State Court of Appeals, wrote a ruling kind of creating a fissure here with the Comstock laws, which you couldn't, no birth control, no contraception. You couldn't even write an article or a letter and mail it through the postal system with like abortion, so on and so forth. It was against federal law. And so Margaret Sanger was running up against this. But the Clinical Research Bureau, she was trying to appeal to now the middle class. Why? That means what? And guess what? In 1924, the Rockefellers gave her $5,000, and in 1925, they gave her another $5,000. Of course, this was supposed to be sotto voce. We don't want our names involved. But she got the money. See where this goes here? So it does take money to have a political agenda here. And so is that where these kids are going to have to, depending on how committed they are. Depending on how committed, now they could go the Black Lives Matter route because Black Lives Matter learned from the NAACP. We don't want to be beholden to the Republicans, and we don't want to be beholden to Democrats. We'll have to see what happens here. But again, money is going to come in here somewhere along the line. It has to. Their parents aren't going to be able to foot all this. Interesting where this is going to go here. And then again, depending on where you get the money from, are there strings going to be attached to that money? And that gets back to what you said before. Well, if they are that committed, we don't want strings attached. You're either with us or against us.
They interviewed one father whose son has had thus far 8 surgeries, looking forward to surgery 9. And he was saying, all he's doing now is praying that his child recovers, and then he will deal with how he's going to pay this massive medical bill. And of course, Florida was under paying for it. But
Right.
it's true, it comes down to dollars and cents.
Oh yeah. Well, next week when we get more into the petrodollar. Yeah, he's laughing. This is the post-war period here, especially like after Vietnam, where the money is devalued here because of the war, and so you have to have some sort of new value for it. Well, how about oil? Of course, some people make I've seen this by some policymakers. Well, what is really the value of the dollar based on now? M1 tanks, F-16s, and Apache attack helicopters. So, yes.
I know this is a simple question, but why did we suffer such great unemployment after World War I? Was so much of our employment tied up with the military that there just wasn't, there weren't jobs for people after the war ended? Yeah,
what's interesting about that, when we get into this conflict, the French expect us to have 23,000 tanks by the next summer. In other words, 1918. It takes a while to convert from a peacetime to a wartime economy.
Right.
And so by the time we're really converting, the war is over. We only made 26 tanks, and only 15 got to the Western Front. But then again, as you're now you're getting off this war, and you got these guys coming home.
Right.
They had a slight depression here after the war. But then again, it didn't last long because the economy picks up with our investing into Europe and investing at home here.
What caused the depression?
Well, they cut off of production for the war. They cut it off.
Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
And so now, but that doesn't happen in 1945.
No.
That really doesn't happen. Why? Because during this war, 16, not 4 million are in uniform, over 16 million. And yet, who had to go to work to make up for the lack of men?
The women.
Women. But, people are making $200 a week, even more. That was unheard of. But with wage and price controls and rationing, could you spend all that money? No. So where'd that money go? In the banks. $150 billion sloshing around in there, and that's going to finance the biggest post-war boom there ever was, and there'll be no depression. And they'll finance the GI Bill, and a lot of these guys are going to go to school, right, and it's going to finance the middle class for the 1950s. Interesting the difference in 45 from 1918.
And these are socialistic policies like the GI Bill.
Oh boy, there's a discussion.
No, I'm serious. I really feel it, it's social security, et cetera, et cetera.
Actually, when you go back from the late 20s into the 30s, when the Depression hits, and Roosevelt has a problem here, go back to what I mentioned earlier, 25% unemployment rate, and yet there are many in his class who, they want to hold on to what they got, and Roosevelt's going to tell them, hey, you better give me some money to help us get out of this, because if not, there are alternatives that the American public might want to look at. Fascism, Nazism, Bolshevism. So what do you want to do? Have a half a loaf or lose it all? Some people will go along with them, but then again, as you know, as you get closer to the war and money is poured into the industry to make weapons, what is it Roosevelt's going to say in the end? I saved capitalism. He's not going to say I saved the worker. I saved capitalism. He wasn't stupid.
No.
He was Wall Street.
Yeah.
Yes.
Actually, the wage and price controls during the war years brought companies paying for medical care as a way of getting the best talent.
Right.
You know, so there was, I don't know what limits they were, but they were offering free medical care.
One of the more interesting aspects of this is the input of socialists and communists in the 30s in the union movement, and helping Mr. Roosevelt push Roosevelt to adopting these programs and trying to get a better deal for the workers. And so it's interesting enough that you see socialists and communists, they're more successful in helping the American worker than they are in Russia.
Yes.
But of course, there's going to be a backlash to that with the McCarthy hearings. Yes?
Mark, when you take a look at the situation in Western Europe between the end of World War I and maybe the late 1920s, wasn't the situation in France and Belgium and Switzerland and England, Austria, their economic situation was such that what happened there basically was the drop-off point for our depression in '29. I mean, the handwriting was on the wall. If we took a look at what was happening in Europe after the war, forget about how badly damaged was their infrastructure.
Right.
You would have seen this complete loss of an economic standard. People were basically almost starving. Our markets overseas were practically nil. We weren't building armaments for the war. Sooner or later, the unemployment was going to go through the ceiling, and the banks failed.
Well, keep in mind here, after Versailles, you know, this idea of this war being fought for democracy, you know, the British and the French got to keep their colonies. This was particularly important for them because they thought those colonies were going to help them get out of this situation they're in.
Worse.
Well, in certain respects, yes. But then again, look at it from the French perspective. You know, when the war starts, they have a manpower pool of 5.9 million men. The Germans have a manpower pool of 9.7 million. Okay, so where are they going to make this up from? They're going to go to Vietnam, they're going to go to Senegal, they're going to go to Morocco, their colonies, and pull these guys out of the jungles, out of the sand, out of the mountains, and stick them in a French uniform and put them on the Western Front. What do these guys have? Are these guys members of the firm here? No, they're not. No, they're not. And so, you know, Georges Clemenceau wants to make sure that he's going to keep his colonies after the war. And, you know, I mean, and again, you heard me say this before, but it bears repeating in this instance. You know, Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points, people will be able to determine their own fate. And what happened to Ho Chi Minh when he went to Versailles? There's the door.
Right.
What happened to the Arabs? There's the door. And so, you know, Clemenceau is annoyed after a while about Wilson's 14 points. He says, Wilson bores me silly with his 14 points. Why, God Almighty only had 10 commandments. They're concerned. They want to keep those colonies. And, you know, you take a look at Germany. Germany had colonies, but what happened to Germany after the war? She not only has a ruined economy, no more colonies. And so, again, that's all part of the economics here. You know, we can grab these people if we need bodies in a uniform, but also use them as a dumping ground for our goods, and also steal their resources. You know, I mean, colonialism. It's a sordid situation for the people who are on the receiving end of it. By receiving end, I mean having the colonial overseers. Well, isn't that why we threw the British out of here? And then we turn around and join them. Again, political agendas change. Somebody else had a hand up. Keith, you did.
Yeah, I was just going to say one of the causes of the depression was the fact that everybody bought on margin. So when the stocks started to drop, they said, "You need more money, more money."
Right.
People didn't have it.
Well, yeah, I mean, you put 10% down, but don't pay the rest of the bill. And so what happens to that paper the stock's printed on?
But there weren't that many people that were invested then in the stock market as now. I mean, a very small percentage of the American public is truly invested in the stock market today. The same thing was true back then. Even those that were buying on margin, it was more the fact of the banks investing abroad, and they couldn't get their money back.
Yeah, but the stock market today there's really only 10% of the American population that really matters in the market. And a lot of those people are buying back these shares just to raise the price per share. And they're not plowing that money into building new facilities like the president said is going to happen.
No, it's dividends.
Correct. And so this is being arranged by a restricted clique. Well, again, we're back to the money and the politics of it. So does that, and you throw in Citizens United here, does that allow you, if you're endowed enough, to control the political agenda? Yeah, of course. I get you back to these kids. We need bodies. Right. Well, that's like when they came out with the Affordable Care Act, and I remember again having a discussion. We were discussing with a group. I said they're going to pick that apart. You watch. They gave it to you now, but they're going to take. So, yes.
The executives buy back the shares, which raises the price of the shares that are out there, and then their bonuses are based on the share price. So they're juicing up the basis for the executive bonuses.
Well, again, going back to what you're saying, I got this book a couple weeks ago because I've been looking for it. It's called Confessions of a Monopolist. Interesting book. Written by a Frederick Clemson Howe in 1906. And he talks, interestingly enough, how to make society work for the few. Yeah. And how to arrange for how the privilege set arranges so that the economy does work for the few at the expense of the many. And this gets you back into the Rockefellers and so on and so forth, and the Morgans and so on and so forth, and companies like GE. Yeah, it's a fascinating read, and he was part of this. And in fact, he wrote an article in 1917 in a magazine, and that's where I got the title from, Financial Imperialism.
Is your name? I mean, you put that together, Mark.
Mm-hmm.
Good for you.
But what I did was that comes from an article Frederick Clemson Howe wrote. And so when you go back to some of these earlier writings and you read some of what was written back then, even before the First World War, by people who helped to fashion this, wow, what a picture you get. What a picture you get. Interesting. Absolutely fascinating. I mean, he later changes his tune, but that's what it is, the Confessions of a Monopolist. And you know, there's a guy up in New York who hunts for books that I can't seem to get down here. And this guy's name is Victor. And he sent me, I was looking for Lenin's book, What Is to Be Done, 1902. And he found an old hard copy. I said, buy it. And so I mailed him a check. He bought it for me. I have it home. And he's fine. In fact, he just found another book I asked him to find, Hannah Arendt on Revolution. And because she's one of the go-to people, if you want to understand like totalitarianism, revolution, that kind of thing. And so interesting. In fact, I sent the order already. I want him to look for another book called Democracy Incorporated by Sheldon Wolin. That book I want. And so it's interesting when you get off the main track here and really take a look at stuff that's really worthwhile looking at. And this book, I'm glad I got it. But I'm going to get into some of what he says the last week. And he calls it Making Society Work for the Few. Interesting title. Yeah, wow is right. Wow is right. Otherwise, that's it. Thank you.